Hey, it's Jag. Welcome to part 3 of the Trinity amps Triwatt build. Today I finish installing all the chassis mounted components and get ready to install the turret board. Next week we're going to break out the soldering iron. Hello? Hey, it's me. Did you know there are aliens at the top levels of the government? Nice hat. Well, first thing, the astute among you probably noticed in my last video that I did not install the base mounts for the tube shields for the 12AX7s. I was so excited to be working on the amp after having a week where I couldn't do it. I got way ahead of myself and didn't even think about mounting the tube shields. I just set them aside. So I'm going to fix that today. You'll see here that I've got 3 of the tube shields already installed with their mounts. So here's the 4th mount, the one for the first tube, and I'm just going to put it in place. Okay, so there's the tube shields and their mounts installed. So some of you may have thought about this as well. When I mounted the retainers for the output tubes, because I mounted the sockets in from the bottom, I put the screws in facing up as well. So I used these Keps nuts to hold the retainers on. That just sort of bugs the OCD guy in me, because over on the 12AX7 sockets, the screws go through from the top. And these ones have nuts here, and it just doesn't look the same. So I don't know what I was thinking. I'm just going to take those Keps nuts off, take the screws out, turn them around, put them in through the top, and I'll use the Keps nuts to hold the sockets on underneath. And then everything will look nice and I'll be happy. Another thing that I haven't mounted, and I think I will mount today, 2 things. I will mount the switch for the bias, to change the bias from KT66 to 6V6. That switch goes in that hole. And I also will install the jack for the overdrive foot switch. No reason not to do that. The wall of that driver is a little too thick to fit in. I got it to fit on the back, but that pushed the socket over that way a little bit and it can't fit here. So I'm just going to use a pair of pliers to snug that up just a little bit. Bet you all thought I was going to say don't over tighten it, eh? It's really important. I had a real habit for years of doing that. Anytime I tightened a screw or nut, a bolt, anything, no matter how tiny, I would tighten it as tight as I could get it. And I have snapped and broken so many screws and bolts and things, and there's just no reason to do that. If you can't loosen it with your fingers, it's probably not going to come loose down the road. It's not like we're making a rocket or a race car. Okay, so there we are. Got the tube sockets mounted again, and the tube shields. Wait for that to focus. The tube shields are on there. So now we'll get on to mounting the transformers, the grounding lugs and terminal strips underneath the chassis. I'm going to start with the power transformer, and that is sitting over here to my right. These transformers are all very heavy, and that's what you want. A lot of good iron, a large transformer. For the power transformer, it will help it stay cooler. It allows it to deliver more current. For the output transformer, a lot of iron, a very large output transformer will contribute to the clarity and the depth of your tone, or the girth. This is the output transformer that comes with the kit. And you have your primary and secondary sides of your transformers. On this transformer, you have a black with a red stripe, and a black with a white stripe. You also have a white, and then a white with a red stripe, and a white with a black stripe. So those all correspond to the different ways you might wire the mains for your for wherever you are. Of course, we're in North America, so I'll be wiring this for 120 volts. Right now, I'm just running the wires through to where they go. It's always a good idea to bring your line voltage in as far to one side of the chassis, the amp, as possible. That's where a lot of noise can come from. If you keep the input lines sort of close to the edge of the corner of the inside chassis, that helps sort of shield some of the noise you can get from your lines. The input lines will go through this grommet, the farthest one to currently my left, and then the secondary side will run through these two grommets. The high voltage lines will go through this grommet here. The heater windings will go through this grommet here. On the secondary side, your heater windings are green and green-yellow. Green-yellow is the center tap, and then the greens are the two outside windings. For the high voltage lines, your center tap is red-yellow, and then you have two red lines. So we'll get these going through the grommets. First the supply line, and then we'll feed the heater supply and the high voltage secondary. So what I want to do is just get these wires more or less started in those holes, and then as I'm lowering the transformer, I'll just keep feeding the wires in through to the bottom. This is one of the reasons I do this before I get the turret board mounted, because you don't want these wires hanging up on things when you're putting them through. That's not the end of the day, but you just end up having a tangled mess underneath to sort out, and they're going to be tangled enough when I turn this over to put the nuts and screws on. So what I'm going to do, now that I have the transformer sitting in place on top of the chassis, I need to actually mount it with the 832 machine screws that are provided in the kit. There are 4 each for the power transformer and the output transformer. So I'm going to put the first one in, and then turn this over and start one of the lock nuts on there. It'll make it easier to put the other screws in. So I've put the screw in down here. I'm holding it with the middle finger of my left hand. I turn the amp on its face, and then I'll take one of the lock nuts and I'll thread it on there. Finger tight. There's not a lot of play, but it's not as tight as it ultimately will be. And then I can turn this back up, and I will put the next mounting screw in. So there we go, that one's in. And this is where it gets a little difficult. I'm still, reaching in there with my finger and holding that screw in while I turn the amp on its face again. And I will screw this second nut in. Or I'll drop it and not know where it went. You really have to have a lot of patience doing this kind of stuff. You're often working in a space that's not quite big enough for your hands or fingers, and things slip around and move a lot. That went pretty good. I've got the first 2 screws mounted. Third screw, I always, for some reason, leave the most difficult one for last. I don't know why. I guess when I find that the first few were easy or hard, I know what to expect with the last one. Last screw for the power transformer. And this is when the chassis starts getting heavy, because it's the iron probably is 90% of the weight of an amp. So this one's a little easier to turn the chassis up on its side and thread this screw on. Sometimes it's just a matter of getting your hand at the right angle and you can do what you're trying to do. So while I have this on its side, I'm going to get a nut driver, and I'm going to drive these nuts or tighten this transformer down. I'll finish pulling the last little bit of the length of wiring through here. Tighten those up. Transformers are obviously heavier, and you use the number 8 screws because they're bigger, they're heftier, and they'll hold that heavy transformer on. So there's the power transformer mounted. The last thing I'm going to do, just to kind of keep things out of my way, is loop the wires back around themselves, just to have these tied up in a nice little bundle until I'm ready to solder them. There's a lot of extra cable, and I'm a big proponent of using everything you get, and I'm glad to say Steven is too. He recommends in the kit that when you start soldering everything, cut your leads, you know, so they just fit where they're going, which is a smart idea for a number of reasons. I'll cover that another time. But also you can use the offcut wire for wiring in other places in the amplifier. Okay, so power transformer's mounted. Time for the output transformer. I have the notes just over to my left here, and I do follow instructions. I'll break this down for a second. When I did the part 1 of this video, I said I was going to follow Steven's instructions to the letter. I am building the amp exactly to the spec. I'm not following the instructions step by step by step by step. I'm doing things in kind of the order that makes a little more sense to me. Not that his instructions don't make sense. It's just easier once you sit down and you're looking at all the parts you have for an amp to say, okay, I'm going to mount this, and this. And it might not match exactly with the instructions. At the end of the day, when the amp's done, you look through the whole thing and you did complete every step. You just didn't follow the order. If you're a beginner, you might want to go in order like that, just because it's easier to remember where you are, what you've done, and if you leave off for one day and you come back another day, you don't have to figure out what did I do or not do. Or even if the amp takes you a month or 2 months to build, you might get that far down the road and you might be soldering the leads for the power transformer, but you installed the power transformer 3 weeks ago and you don't remember what wires go where. When you're first building a kit, you do want to follow it step by step. Okay, so the output transformer, which I love that it says Partridge on here. Partridge were the transformers used in the original high watts. There's a lot of mojo about what transformers were used for what purpose in whatever amp. Marshalls, Fenders, high watts, Orange, all of those amps. And I think very wisely this transformer is spec'd on a Partridge, you know, so I think its specs match a Partridge pretty closely. And so if that mojo of a Partridge amplifier in or a Partridge transformer in a high watt amplifier really does mean so much, you would want a transformer spec to those original specs. So I'm pretty happy about that. So shut up, Jag, get this started. Now I'm going to mount the output transformer. So the output transformer has its primaries and secondaries. These are the primaries. So we have brown with a white stripe, we have red, we have blue, and we have blue with a white stripe. Alright, took a little bit of a break, had to sort out a few things about the output transformer mounting and orientation. So it's important that your transformers be lined up so the fields that they generate are not in phase with each other. If they're in phase, in other words, all the coil and everything is in the same orientation, you can have hum induced from one to the other. The instructions are clear enough to me about orienting the transformers. For those of you who may not know, you put the power transformer lying down along its long axis and the coil is going around horizontally. The output transformer you put on its short axis up and down, and the coil is going vertically. So they are out of phase with each other and they will cancel hum that way. Now the output transformer, like I say, lying on its short axis, the wires come out this side, which is toward the grommets. Obviously this is well thought out. So the primary side, the primary on a transformer, any transformer, is always where the signal or voltage goes in. Secondary is where it comes out. So the primary side on this transformer, we have a blue wire, a blue-white wire, a brown-white wire, and a red wire. The red wire is the center tap, and we'll get to what all of that means when I'm actually doing the soldering. So those go through this grommet. The secondary wires for the transformer, there's an orange, a green, a yellow, and a black. Again, I'll explain which ones are for what taps when I'm actually wiring it on the bottom. Another thing that has to happen with these transformers is you want to twist or braid the wires together. The reason you do that is there's what's called a common mode rejection. I won't explain that right now, but when you twist those wires together, noise in each wire basically is out of phase with each other. You twist them around together and they interact to cancel noise. So again, we mount this with 4 number 8 machine screws, and I'm going to do same as last time. Put the first screw in and hold it in, turn the amp on its face, and thread on the first nut. It can be a little fiddly getting it in. What I'm having a problem with right now is the way that this machine screw that's already on there sticks out. It's kind of in the way of getting the screw in there. So I'm going to just put the screw in ahead of time here, and then sit this down and get the screw to go through the hole. There we go. That was pretty easy. So I'll turn this on its face again while I'm holding that screw in, and I will thread on the nut. And same as with the power transformer, I'm going to tighten this as snug as I can get it by hand so that it just won't wobble around too much. Again, this is going to be easier to do this one by putting the chassis up on its side. And then we'll snug up those nuts. Might have to stop being so lazy and get my tweezers. We'll see. Ha! Once again, laziness wins. So once I'm done mounting the output transformer, I'm going to turn this over. I will put the grounding lugs and terminal strips. I will install them next. And that might be it for the video for this week. So that's the output transformer mounted. I'll pull the wires through, do the same thing. I'll make sure I've got them pulled fairly tight. Don't pull them so tight that they're going to be stressed on the other side, but pull them tight enough that you don't have a bunch of loose wire running around. It's important for some of these, especially on the output, that you have your leads be as short as possible, just to reduce issues around potential oscillation. You know, an earlier stage injecting its signal, or a later stage injecting its signal into an earlier stage, that can cause oscillations or feedback. You know, if you get the high squeal, that's an oscillation, as opposed to a ring, which is usually a problem with a tube going bad. They get microphonic and they start ringing. So anyway, you want to keep your signal wires separate and as short as possible, or you know, at least so they're not getting close to a stage before them. But you don't want to have the leads pulled so tight that they're under stress. Even though it's a metal chassis, those transformers are heavy and the chassis can shift a bit. Not really much, but you don't want that pulling transformer leads or breaking them. Okay, so I've got the transformers mounted, fixed up my problems, or fixed up the issues with the mounting bases for the tube shields, and the way I have the output tube sockets mounted. Alright, well, I just killed about half an hour confusing myself on part of the list. In looking at the instructions, well, what it says here, terminal strips with nuts, and then it says nuts in brackets 6. and I only had 2 nuts, so I was trying to figure out what was going on with that. And it turns out what I did was here on the output tube sockets, if you recall, I installed them from underneath the chassis to give that just that little bit of extra room in case I want to put KT66s in there. If you recall, I took those out, put the screws in from the top down through the retainers, and then put the Keps nuts on the bottom to hold the tube sockets in. Well, it turns out that's where my 4 missing Keps nuts are. So I'm going to take those off, and I'm just going to go ahead and mount the output tube sockets on the top of the chassis, just like all of the others. I'm not likely to use KT66s. The other option, I suppose, is I could have run out and got some nuts for that. I don't really want to spend the time to do that, and of course we're still in the middle of COVID, so I'm not going out in general public anytime I don't have to. Why would I? Okay, so the sockets are going in from the top and the spring retainers, the tube retainers. It was very common, is very common, where they would solder grounding lugs and terminal strips right to the chassis. That's an option too, and technically you could probably argue it's a better way to do it because that's a lot more solid of a connection. You want that connection to be as solid and immovable as possible. I'm just fine using a screw with a Keps nut, with a lock washer on it. I always wonder how much of this footage I'm actually going to use or not use. Sometimes I end up with an hour and a half of footage and I get maybe 15 usable minutes out of it. It's always a curious thing. I think it catches a lot of people that they watch a video like this and say, oh look, he did that in 15 minutes, 20 minutes, 25 minutes. I watched the whole series. It was 8 videos and he built that amp in under 2 hours, and the truth is, no, he didn't. Even if he wasn't filming, taking care of cameras, thinking about what he's saying, correcting himself, all of those things, you would still have an amp that's probably 2 solid 7-8 hour days. You'd probably finish the amp. It's not as easy as it always looks. Okay, so that's done. So now we will move on to terminal strips and grounding lugs. Number 4 grounding lug. Terminal strip between normal and bright volume, terminal strip between the presence and master volume, ground for the power supply. Those are 2 number 6 ground lugs, a number 8 grounding lug for the mains ground. We have a terminal strip here between the 2 output tubes just behind the bias pot, and we have terminal strips mounted on V1 and V3. V1, V2, V3, that's a valve. So generally the convention goes from your first preamp tube and then follows the flow through. So V1 is preamp tube 1, V2 preamp tube 2, V3 preamp tube 3, V4 is the phase inverter, which is not really a preamp tube, so that's V4. And then V5 and V6 in this amp are the output tubes. You'd also have a V7 and V8 if you had 4 output tubes or a 100-watt amp. I will start with the grounding lug that goes over here behind the normal and bright inputs. And I'm going to stick with my convention and put this in with the screw from the outside of the chassis, the top of the chassis coming in. And then I'll put the nut on the grounding lug. The orientation of that strip doesn't matter too much. I'm going to put it right now toward the outside of the chassis, just because it'll leave a little more room to get at it. If I turn it the other way so that it's oriented this way, the turret board might get a little in the way of my big fingers. Your grounds need to have a really solid connection. So there's that. I'm just going to leave this up on its side while I put the other a couple of the other terminal strips. I've got the one to put in between the normal and bright volume, and the one to put in between the presence and master. and I even have this one at the back to put in. I don't need to worry. I can put these two terminal strips on with the chassis back flat because they're going on the screws that are already through. I'll also do the mains ground and the power ground while I'm doing this. When I was 10 and I first started working on electronics, if I had known my fingers were going to get as big as they are, I might have done something else, because I can barely get in here. The middle terminal on these strips just about always is the one that connects it to the chassis, and it's just so that just about always makes it a ground. One or two of them will be utilized for the ground connection, but a couple others are not. So I'm just going to make sure that these connections are good and solid. Alright, the one between the presence and master volume. So the next one to mount is two number 6 lugs for the power transformer ground. Okay, and a number 8 for the mains ground. A good, solid, robust connector for that. Now, lock nut, lock nut, lock nut. So I need to mount a terminal strip right here, and one here, and one here. So, and one goes here. When you do your regular maintenance on an amp, you should always check these terminals to make sure that the nut hasn't come loose. Alright, we'll just summarize this. We've got this grounding lug right here. It's on there solid. We've got the terminal strip between the two bright and master volume controls. We've got a terminal strip here between the presence and master, and that's on there good and tight. We've got the power transformer, the ground for the power transformer. We've got the mains ground right here. We've got the terminal strip right behind the bias pot here. And then we've got terminal strips on here and one here. So they're there. So we got that one, we got that one, we got that one, we got that, we got that, we got that, we got that, and we got that. So we'll double check everything when I think I'm done, but that's it for the grounding lugs and the terminal strips. I'm going to leave the turret board out for now, so I can start on the next video soldering components on that. Okay, so that's just about everything. I'm just going to put the standoffs and screws for the turret board on here. There are 4 extra number 6 lock washers here. The instructions say to put the turret board to mount it to the chassis using the standoffs with lock nut. There's no need for the lock nut because the chassis itself is threaded for the machine screws. I don't see anywhere else these little toothed washers go, so I'm just going to put them on the turret board side of these screws that go through the standoffs. And I'm just doing this so I don't lose these. We'll mount the bias switch and the jack for the overdrive. Check out our work and we're done. So the bias switch has a very long threaded exit for it, or a threaded stem, and I don't like those to stick too far above the chassis. They come with 2 nuts, so you can adjust the depth of it as it goes into the chassis. The outside washer for the bias switch, it has a tab. That's like just with the pots on the faceplate and the bias pot. That little tab is so you can locate it in a little hole and the switch won't spin. That's not being utilized here. Some people cut that little tab off or file it. I just put it with the tab sticking up on the other side of the chassis. Works just fine and you don't have to do the extra work. Okay, last thing to put in, the overdrive switch. There are 2 fiber washers that come with this jack, and I probably will only need 1. I'm going to do that with the tabs up, make it easier to solder on them. And I just noticed that I'm going to have to turn the input jacks because one of them is sticking down too far. Oh, I need 2 fiber washers. Interesting. So the jack on the back needs both of the fiber washers. Must be a slightly different design or something. So, okay, so this input jack, the tabs are sticking up a little too far outside the chassis. So I'm going to turn that jack sideways. I'm going to turn both those jacks sideways. Okay, so time to summarize what we've done so far. Next week the fun starts. So, looking down here, we installed the preamp tube sockets and their shields. We installed the output tube sockets and spring retainers. We've got the bias switch installed, the cap can. We've got the power transformer and the output transformer. Everything on this side is looking good, looking solid. Faceplate is installed. One thing you want to watch out for with this is the faceplate, because it's only held on by the knobs and jacks and switches. At the outer ends, it can flex out, and you want to be careful that you don't catch that on something and crack the faceplate or bend it out. As a matter of fact, one thing I usually do, if you saw in the unboxing, the faceplate was taped onto the chassis, and I like to do that again just so that I don't risk catching that on something and breaking the faceplate. And I generally put a piece of tape on the top and the bottom so that these corners are less likely to catch on something. Top of it, vintage amps, Marshalls, Fenders, all of them generally mount their faceplates the same way. Vintage Fender faceplates are made of metal, and you'll find that it's been bent and bent back, so there'll be a crease in it. Or on the plexis, the Marshall with the plexi fronts, those can be just, they break. Sometimes they're bent and been straightened out again, but more often than not they break if they get caught just right. So there we go. And just remember to be careful when you're moving it around. So inside the chassis and back panel, so we've got the overdrive switch, we've got the speaker jacks, we've got the impedance selector, we've got the bias test point jacks and the bias pot installed, we've got the IEC connector for the power, we've got the fuse holder. Not installing the effects board yet, and this little board that I haven't mentioned before, but this little board that's mounted on the chassis up here in the corner, that's the relay board for the overdrive switch. Today we did the transformers, installed them. The wires are pulled through here. The wires need to be dressed properly. You have to twist them, braid them together, and I will do that when we get ready to install the turret board. So for now I'm just going to leave these here as they are. We have the standoffs for the turret board installed. We have the 5 terminal strips installed. We have the mains ground, we have the power transformer ground, we have the preamp ground over here, we have the bias switch. That's a good amount of work. All of these first 3 videos, you can consider them prep. This is all prep for getting to the point where we start soldering and actually start making something that is going to be an amp. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe. Check out Trinity Amps. I think that's trinityamps.com. Made to be played. And check out my band, One Soul Thrust. As always, links are in the description below. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next week for part 4.